Hello, everybody. Welcome. We'll just give it a few seconds to let everybody get into the meeting. Okay, I think that's everybody for now. So, hello, thanks for coming along today to our Introduction to Carbon Farming webinar. So this webinar is aimed at landholders at the very beginning of their carbon journey. I'm Nikki Ledger, the project delivery lead here at the Carbon Farming Foundation, and I'll be joined in just a minute by Helena Bowler, who is our Chief Operating Officer. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of Wooditchup or Margaret River, where the Carbon Farming Foundation is based. These original land managers hold a deep spiritual connection to the ecosystems of Wadandi Noongar country, and we thank them for sharing their knowledge with us so generously. Elders past and present, and extend that respect to the elders in the communities where you're all calling from today. So a quick run through of the agenda for today. I'll provide a brief overview of the Carbon Farming Foundation and then pass over to Helena for a Carbon Farming 101, which will include an introduction to the methods we work with, some case studies so you can see how they apply in practice. We'll run through how our organisation can help you as a landholder, and then at the end we'll answer any questions as time allows. So we gathered your questions from the registration, and if you have any others, please feel free to drop them into the Q&A box throughout the webinar, which should be across the top of your screen. Quick disclaimer, so we'll be running through some financial case studies today, and as part of our Australian Financial Services licence, we need to let you know that all the numbers presented are indicative only, and you need to consider your personal financial circumstances when considering a carbon farming project. So all advice given today is general advice only, and we recommend you read our financial services guide, which is available on our website, or seek independent financial advice. So who is CFF? We're a not-for-profit registered charity which exists to provide a different model for landholders to access the carbon market. So we've been operating since 2020 and we've registered 24 projects for landholders across reforestation, plantation forestry and soil carbon methods. We're a remote team and we provide compliance and project coordination support, which helps us to keep our costs and impacts to a minimum. Since we've launched, we've had a strong focus on educating the landholder community, and we have an education hub with heaps of resources on our website, which can help you build your carbon knowledge before you go ahead with the project. We've always believed that landholders should reap the rewards for their land, so we work on a 100% fee-for-service basis, with all of the carbon credits going directly to the landholder. We don't keep any of them. And we have a transparent fee structure which allows you to pick and choose which tasks you need our help with. And we have no lock-in contracts, so landholders can opt out at any time. So with that, I will pass you over to Helena, who will give you a Carbon Farming 101. Over to you, Hel.
Thank you, Nikki. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here today to run you through a bit of a crash course in carbon farming so that you have a better understanding on whether it's something that could benefit your property. I'll start off with some general information on the Australian Government's ACCU scheme, which is the scheme that we support landholders with. And this applies to all methods. And then we'll dive into the main three methods that CFF supports and go through a few case studies. Of course, carbon farming, it's a lot to squeeze into just a 45-minute period. So we'll try and answer some of your questions at the end, but we're always here to help. As Nikki mentioned, we've got our education hub as well, but feel free to reach out to myself or someone in the team, and we're happy to help with any extra questions if we don't get to them today. So jumping straight in, what actually is carbon farming and how does it work in practice? At a very high level, a carbon farming project essentially requires you to implement a new or additional activity which will avoid or sequester carbon emissions. You need to do this activity in such a way as it complies with a set methodology, which is essentially acting as your underpinning rule book of how you complete your project. Once your project is established, you then need to continue to monitor, report, and verify that you're sequestering the amount of carbon you originally estimated. And if everything is going according to plan, you'll earn Australian carbon credit units, which are also known as ACCUs. So in Australia, the carbon market is administered by the Clean Energy Regulator, which runs the ACCU scheme. The scheme consists of the Carbon Farming Initiative Act and Rule, which are the key pieces of legislation governing the scheme. There are also the various methodologies, and today I'll talk through the key three methods that CFF supports, which are the Reforestation by Environmental or Mallee Plantings full CAM method, the Plantation Forestry method, and also the Estimating Soil Carbon method. So that's the very high level sort of governing side of things. But what actually is a ACCU? It's also known as a carbon credit, and under the ACCU scheme, each credit represents 1 tonne of carbon dioxide or carbon dioxide equivalent greenhouse gas. They're issued by the regulator, the CER, and they're held in an ANREU account. They are a financial product, so you can think of them as being similar to like a share, which sits in a share registry. Once you have those credits in your account, you can either choose to retire them to inset your operational emissions if you're looking to move towards net zero or carbon neutral, for example. This may help you to attract a price premium or access markets that require emissions reductions. Alternatively, you can also hold credits on your balance sheet for future use. We generally do advise our clients to hold on to a portion of their credits in the event that there is a reversal event such as a fire or a drought. So it's always good to essentially hold on to a few at the start and make sure you'll see in a moment our timelines. These projects go for a very long time, so it can always help to keep a few in the bank just to make sure that you're meeting all of your requirements along the way. You can also trade your credits though. So if you're looking for a diversification in your income streams, for example, you could do this through forward contracts with the government. So essentially promising some credits ahead of time and then you could pay them back over time. Or you could also do it via spot sales on the private market, similar to selling shares essentially. So understanding crediting and permanent period. These are two of the key terms that are essential to understand for ACCU scheme projects. And as I just mentioned, they're key to understanding the timeframes of these projects. In the graphic above, we can see there's a graph there that represents a pretty generic carbon yield for a vegetation-based project or a reforestation project. We generally see that in this curve, the amount of carbon your project sequesters increases quite quickly at the start, which is while your trees are growing, and then slows down a little bit once your trees have matured. You can see the graph sort of peter out there. This carbon sequestration generates ACCUs for a 25-year period, which is known as the crediting period, and is represented in our graphic with the dark brown arrow underneath that carbon curve. This is the period in which your credits are issued, and it actually starts on your registered project start date and then continues for 25 years beyond that. When you register your project with the CER, you will also need to nominate either a 25 or 100-year permanence period. This is the time frame in which you're committing to actually run your project for and doesn't actually commence until you submit your very first offset report and are issued your first ACCUs. So again, in the graphic, you can see that represented by the grey arrows instead, and it starts just a little bit further along the carbon yield curve. This means that, for example, if you do choose to undertake a 25-year permanence period for a plantation forestry project, for example, and you complete your first report in year 3 of your project, you will then need to continue to manage the trees in this project for a total of 28 years from the start of your project registration. So it extends a bit further beyond just your crediting period. Now, as you imagine, committing to a 100-year project has a higher risk profile as you're required to continue to manage the project for a significant amount of time beyond the end of your crediting period, and you're not receiving credits during that extra, say, 75-ish years. However, these projects are viewed by the regulator to be a more permanent project, and therefore you are actually entitled to receive slightly more ACCUs than those undertaking a 25-year permanence, which does give some incentive for landowners to opt for this longer permanence period. But you really need to understand and make a decision around what level of risk you're willing to take with these projects. So those are the very high level basics that underpin all of our projects. I'll now jump into some more of the specifics on each individual method. One of the main methods that we support is the reforestation by environmental and mallee plantings full cam method. You may have caught our previous webinar where we discussed the newly released method, and so we're thrilled to see this one back online as of late last year. Participating in a reforestation carbon project essentially involves planting, growing and maintaining a permanent forest of native trees on land that has been clear of forest for at least 5 years and native vegetation for at least 7 years. So essentially think of a nice cleared agricultural paddock or agricultural property that's just ready to be planted on. By building carbon stocks in your trees, shrubs and the debris across a 25-year period, you're removing it from the atmosphere. This removal and then the resulting increase in your carbon stocks is what earns you credits. There are many reasons beyond just carbon credits to undertake a reforestation project. So I'll dive into some of them here. But essentially, planting trees can improve farm productivity in many ways. Several studies show improved soil fertility and water infiltration, as well as reduced wind speeds and wind chill for livestock as well. There's a great article actually that was shared on sustainablefarms.org, and they looked at the impact on sheep farms, showing that integrated shelter belts reduced mortality of lambs by 10%, boosted pasture production for livestock by up to 8%, increased wool production by more than 30%, and weight gain in livestock by more than 20%. So I definitely encourage you checking that one out. One of the first things that we do at the CFF to support landowners is determine how we can best design their project to achieve the outcomes important to them. So we like to think that ACCUs are just the icing on the cake, and we try and focus on the key goals of your property and potentially your farm as a whole and see how we can integrate it all together to achieve your goals. As I mentioned previously, we did see the release of the latest version of this method late last year. This slide is just a very quick snapshot of the key differences for you to be aware of. Most of them are positive and pragmatic changes to help landowners undertaking reforestation projects. So for example, one of the bigger changes is the ability to commence project activities, or a few of the project activities, once registration has been submitted to the CER. Previously, proponents had to wait until their project was fully approved before they could conduct any activities such as site prep and planting, which made it quite difficult to plan and meet some planting windows. Often it meant that planting had to be deferred to the following year, whereas now proponents can actually order seedlings and start some of that site prep as soon as the application is submitted, which just provides a lot more flexibility. As project approval, of course, though, is not quite guaranteed yet, it's still being assessed. There is some risk involved, but strong due diligence can help mitigate this. And as long as you're pulling together a very thorough registration, then the risk is quite low, which is good. If you are interested to know a bit more about the difference between this version and the previous version of the method, then we actually did one of these webinars in December. So I encourage you to go and watch that one, and we go fully into detail of all the changes with our head of compliance. We are often asked the question, how big does my property need to be to participate in a carbon project, specifically around the reforestation requirements? Unfortunately, the truth is there is no one answer, because the carbon yields across the country and each landowner's context can be very, very different. So in general, we do find that projects smaller than 200 hectares can be quite difficult to meet financial viability just because of the ongoing reporting and auditing costs involved with a project. The Australian government therefore introduced the Environmental Planting Pilot, which is also known as an alternative assurance pathway, which enables smaller projects to significantly reduce their ongoing costs by offering the ability for audits to be completed remotely and simplifying their reporting requirements. This program was available under the previous reforestation method, and we're currently providing feedback on the continuation of the program with the new method. So we're hoping to see this one be re-released very soon. We therefore do encourage landowners with smaller parcels of land to get in touch with us so that we can determine if the program is beneficial to you, and hopefully we can still get your smaller project registered. Jumping back into carbon yield curves, as we saw earlier in the presentation, we do expect that with reforestation projects, the carbon yield follows a curve similar to the one presented under a reforestation project. Most projects will see 60% of their credits in the first 10 years, just because of that immediate growth in the trees, and then, as I said previously, the maturing of those trees. In the graph, we can see that we've circled some potential reporting years as well, where your credits will be issued. So, for example, if you completed your first report in year 3, you'd expect to receive approximately 12% of your total credit. The CER requires you to submit an offset report at least every 5 years. However, to give yourself some flexibility in your timing, we recommend completing your first report at year 3 and then in 5 yearly intervals after this to keep costs to a minimum whilst also bringing in some ACCUs throughout the project. So let's jump into some examples. It's been very technical so far. So this will help us to more deeply understand reforestation project financials and potential outcomes. This is a carbon heat map which we can produce for one of our projects in Queensland. Now, a quick note here, the carbon yields on this heat map are quite high. Queensland does tend to get relatively high carbon yields just due to climatic variation and all those sorts of things. As you can see, there is a fair amount of variation across the property though. So these carbon yields have been modelled with the CSIRO's full carbon accounting model as required by the method, and gives us an indication of what yields we can expect once this property has been planted later this year. We can see that the southern half of the property is quite low yielding, that blue shaded area. So if the landowner was restricted in how many hectares they're able to commit to the project, in our planning phase, what we would do here is we would try and target the areas in the northern portion to get the most out of the project. That's where this heat mapping can be really helpful, because you can really target in and essentially get the most value out of your project. So using this property as an example, if we assume that the landowners plant out 200 hectares of this property with an average carbon yield of 973 tonnes of carbon equivalent per hectare, which was essentially that middle range on our heat map, then we're looking at generating approximately 150,000 ACCUs, which is pretty great. The setup costs of this type of project under a DIY model or CFF's partnership model would be approximately 700,000, which accounts for 3,000 per hectare of planting costs, plus the fees to have the CFF register the project with the Clean Energy Regulator, and a preliminary inspection by a qualified forester as well. So essentially all your consultant and planting fees in there. You'll then have approximately 206 grand of ongoing costs, which include any follow-up inspections that you need, your offset reporting and auditing costs, and they're all essential for you to actually claim and be issued your credit. So you may choose to hold on to your ACCUs and utilise them for insetting purposes, or you may choose to sell them on the voluntary market. Using the recent spot price of $34, you'd then expect to see for this project a pre-tax profit of approximately 4.5 million at this property. One of the other opportunities that you do have when establishing a reforestation project is to layer in biodiversity benefits. The Accounting for Nature framework allows project owners to verify environmental claims either as co-benefits of an ACCU scheme project or as a standalone biodiversity credit. So environmental accounting uses the Accounting for Nature framework and allows you to measure the baseline environmental condition of an environmental asset, such as an area of native vegetation or a particular threatened species. A list of methodologies currently available to measure this asset condition can be found on that little URL that we popped on the slide there. A econ score, which is known as an environmental condition score, from 0, fully degraded, to 100, which is an undegraded state, is calculated for your environmental assets. The environmental account is then repeated in future years to measure the changes in your econ score. So, for example, for reforestation, you could complete a baseline prior to your planting of your trees. You'd expect your econ score would be relatively low. And then once you plant your trees, you can remeasure, you'll have all those native species there, and you'd imagine that your econ score will then increase. At CFF, we are certified general experts, and we can therefore help facilitate the establishment of an environmental account at your property or project site. The first step we undertake is a scoping assessment, which is very similar to our carbon feasibility assessments, which I'll talk a bit more about later, and is intended to prepare you for the step 1 in this image here, which is designing. By conducting a desktop level assessment in accordance with the Accounting for Nature framework. This then gives you an in-depth understanding of your property and the environmental assets before you then make any financial decisions. If you are adding an environmental account, or you're interested in adding an environmental account to an ACCU project, we would then suggest that you undertake this step at the same time as your ACCU project feasibility assessment so that we can ensure the two align. And if you'd like to explore that, just let us know that you're keen in layering biodiversity and we can give you all the different options. Cool. So that was reforestation in a very quick nutshell. We'll now move on to plantation forestry, which is our second most popular method. At CFF, we help landowners start and manage plantation forestry carbon projects, which aim to accumulate or sequester carbon as trees are grown and managed within a plantation, and is administered again by the clean energy regulator, just like the reforestation method. This includes the carbon stored in the trees, as well as the debris and the harvested wood products as well. By building up the carbon stocks within the plantation and its products, you are then removing carbon from the atmosphere. So again, this removal and the subsequent increase in your carbon stocks is what earns you carbon credits. Of course, depending on the type of plantation project you run, and the sale of wood products could also earn you additional revenue. Just with the reforestation method, this method also utilises the CSIRO's full carbon accounting model to model the predicted carbon yield of your project. So the plantation forestry method has 4 different options, all known as schedules. You may choose to plant out a new plantation forest in previously fallow land under Schedule 1, or you could have an old plantation that you're keen to harvest and then replant to a mix of native species under Schedule 4. We're happy to work through all of the different options with you to determine which schedule best suits your needs and which ones you're eligible for, because each schedule has a very specific set of requirements to ensure that you're able to participate in them. So let's jump into another case study just to work through some of the financial outcomes of a plantation forestry project. This one we'll now move over to Gippsland in Victoria, and you can see here that they've identified a suitable area for a Schedule 1 project amongst an existing plantation. These properties here are actually quite small, so they're part of an aggregated project, which means that they've brought together smaller properties to share costs across them and make the project more financially viable. And this is something that you could also do under the reforestation method as well. So if we take a look at these indicative numbers, there's a total of 300 hectares available for establishing a new plantation under Schedule 1 in this aggregated project. There's an average of 356 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent, which results in generating 67,000 ACCUs for this project. Unlike reforestation, we don't include the cost of sourcing and planting the trees within our initial costs because in our experience, plantation forestry businesses have a far better understanding of these costs. So the initial costs here are only for the setup of the carbon project itself, such as registration with the CER. So you'll see that it is a significantly smaller cost in this one compared to the reforestation one. Similarly, the ongoing costs are for the carbon project requirements only, such as offset reporting and auditing, not for the maintenance of the plantation itself. If we then look at the same $34 carbon price, this project is anticipating a pre-tax profit of $2 million. So jumping along to soil, our third and final method. This method is one that we support the facilitation of registration, but it is essential to work with an agronomist to determine how you can best build soil carbon on your property and in your specific context. We're experts when it comes to compliance with the ACCU scheme, but we're not able to provide agronomy advice. Participating in a soil carbon project involves managing your land in a way that increases the amount of carbon stored in your soils. By building these soil carbon stocks, you're therefore removing it from the atmosphere. This removal then earns you carbon credit, as with the other methods. Unlike the vegetation methods, however, this one doesn't actually use the full carbon accounting model, but instead uses a measured approach whereby you take physical samples of your soils at the beginning of your project and then throughout your project. So what are the actual stages of a soil carbon project? As with all projects, we start off with feasibility of the project to determine eligibility and financial outcomes for this project. As this is a measured method, it can be helpful for us to review any previous soil tests that you have of the property or have some preliminary soil tests completed to give you an idea of your starting soil carbon levels and determine what a reasonable increase could look like. We then complete your registration and gather the required documentation with the help from your farm manager or agronomist and organise your baseline sampling. Your baseline sampling is completed prior to you starting any of your new activities and essentially sets your foundational level of the carbon. We then partner with trusted soil samplers across Australia to complete this in a way that is compliant with the CER's methodologies. Then it's over to you to start implementing your new activities and build the carbon in your soil. There's a list of specific activities that you can choose from, which we go through at that feasibility stage so that you can identify which of the specific activities will be best suited to your property. So let's have a look at one of our projects in central New South Wales, which was registered a couple of years ago. This was our sampling plan where you can see random points across the property have been identified across the different carbon estimation areas. So there's 100 samples taken across this one in total. For this property, they were able to identify 670 hectares for the farm managers to implement new activities and build soil carbon. They chose to do rotational grazing as well as applying compost under this project. They're aiming to increase an average of 0.48% across their 60 centimetre soil profile using regional benchmarks to test that out. To set the project up, including registering with the CER and completing their baseline sampling, they had an initial outlay cost of $135,000, followed by $598,000 in ongoing costs for repeated soil sampling, reporting, and auditing of the project. They're expecting to generate 46,000 ACCUs if they reach their 0.48% target. And if they were to sell these ACCUs at the $34 carbon price, then they're looking at 840,000 in profits before tax. So now that we understand the key basics for each method, I'll walk you through how we recommend you prepare to undertake a project and go through the proper due diligence process to understand if a project might be right for you. The first step that we recommend in the CFF journey is to explore the feasibility of a carbon project on your land. We've got a couple of different options for tackling this to allow you to choose an approach that suits you and or your team. The first of these is our question and answer presentation. We cover high-level eligibility, financial modelling and a carbon yield assessment to assist you in understanding the opportunity. We encourage you to bring along any key decision makers and ask us plenty of questions. We work with you to adjust any of our assumptions and inputs to ensure that these are relevant to your specific context and scenario. The other option that we have is our tailored feasibility report. This is a more in-depth document which provides a detailed look at cash flow analysis, eligibility, practical suitability, and recommendations to enhance your project practically and financially. We've developed this to be suitable for you to give to any key decision makers, banks, lenders, those sorts of people. And this is also accompanied by our method-specific guidebooks, which run through the method requirements in simple, easy to understand manners. Essentially, it unpacks everything that I've been through today, but in a guidebook form, so you can take your time with it. Whichever option you choose, though, our goal with these is to ensure that you feel informed enough to then proceed with full confidence and you're making a fully informed decision. So this is an indicative project timeline for pretty much all carbon projects that we support. We usually find that the feasibility stage takes around 3 to 6 months. This involves some initial discussions to understand your project goals and ensure that you're comfortable with the feasibility of the project. So this is when we undertake either that report or presentation. Sometimes we do both. The project registration phase usually takes 6 to 9 months, depending on how quickly the information can be gathered. This does include a 90-day assessment period as well from the Clean Energy Regulator. From there, you can commence project establishment. This can take some time as you'll need to undertake any baseline sampling for soil carbon or wait for the propagation of your seedlings for your vegetation-based method. You may also choose to plant over multiple years to spread costs and give yourself more flexibility. Once established, you then enter your project monitoring phase. The CFF are available to support you throughout on a fee-for-service basis. You likely won't need us every year, but we'll stay in touch to ensure that you're across any of your obligations and your project is progressing successfully. At intervals of up to 5 years across that 25-year crediting period, you will need to report on your project to the Clean Energy Regulator, which may also require independent audits to verify the accuracy of the report. Every reporting event will trigger the issuance of ACCUs, which you can then choose to sell, hold, or retire. Whatever stage of your project you're at, the team at CFF have ample experience and are happy to support you throughout. So how does the CFF work with landowners? We have a partnership model. We work with trusted partners across Australia to deliver projects on a low-cost basis. We don't claim to be forestry or agronomy experts, and we stick to compliance with the ACCU scheme methodologies and project facilitation. The landowner owns the project and the land, which means ultimately they're in charge of the project and entitled to 100% of the carbon credit. It's important that they build a relationship with their chosen experts and are able to oversee the on-ground works to ensure that the project is delivered in line with their needs and goals. We are then the remote-based support team, and we're here to help you with every step of the way. With our flexible fee-for-service packages, you're able to take on as much or as little of the project as suits your budget and needs. We connect you to our trusted network, and we help with any of the technical or compliance queries that you may have along the way. The local experts that you engage can vary from accounting or tax advice with regards to using the carbon credits themselves, or they may be site preparation crew preparing your land for planting. There are many ways for projects to be established on ground, and surrounding yourself with the right people is very important. We always have clear responsibilities and timelines set out at the beginning of the project to ensure everyone is staying on the same page. So to date, we've supported a range of landowners to deliver nearly 14,000 hectares of carbon projects across Australia. And with the introduction of the new method, we're already forecasting 2025 to be our biggest yet. Here are some of our valued clients, with many of these undertaking multiple projects with us as key partners. We work with a range of landowners and land managers, including smaller family farms, conservation-minded individuals and groups, utility providers, and a number of medium and large corporate agriculture and forestry companies. And these are just some nice things that people have said. So I feel like I whipped through that. But yes, I appreciate everyone joining us today. I will now hand back over to Nikki.
Okay, thanks so much for that, Helena. That was awesome. So now we will jump into a few questions that were submitted on the registration forms. So first one, how do you find the break-even point on a project?
Good question. So one of the key things that we do in our feasibility reports is actually produce a nice cash flow graph, which helps people to understand where their costs are coming in and when you'll be issued ACCUs to potentially have some income coming back to yourself. If we assume that you are selling your ACCUs to generate income, then your break-even point will likely land on one of the years when you are completing an offset report and you're having your credit issued, because you're able to then on-sell them. Depending on the yield of the project, this can be earlier or later in the 25-year crediting period. But if you have strong yields, it most commonly lands in your second or third reporting period, which we often recommend completing in years 5 and year 10.
Okay, that's good. So you can see some returns from your projects quite early on, which is great. If you have any other questions as we're going through this, please feel free to drop them into the Q&A box and we will hopefully get to them. So next question, how do the models allow for different rainfall and growth cycles in plantation forestry particularly?
Good question. So I kind of brushed over the full carbon account model because there's a lot to it. There's a lot of technical detail, but a very quick explainer on the model will help answer this question. Basically, it works by locating a specific coordinate on your property or on your project, which will then incorporate all of the climatic information of that specific point, including things like rainfall. It also takes into account soil type. Essentially, everything that's has climatic data, the CSIRO, have pulled into that model. You then, as you work your way through inputting data into the model, you do also include the specific species that you're growing, and you download the average species data, which is pulled through from your NPI region. Most common plantation forestry species are in there, not all of them, but eucalypts, blue gums and your pines, those sorts of things all have specific calibrations within the model. So it means that full CAM is calibrated very specifically to give you the most accurate carbon yield reading for that exact coordinate location where your project actually is.
Okay, lovely. Is landholder produced biochar allowed in the scheme?
There are provisions for the application of biochar within the soil carbon method. However, there's no specific ACCU scheme specifically for biochar alone. So if you're interested in applying biochar as part of a soil carbon project, let us know and we can talk through some of the restrictions around that one.
And you can check on the Clean Energy Regulator website for what new methods they're looking to develop in the future. So it may be that there'll be a method for that coming at some point.
That's great.
Question here from Dom, which is possibly a tricky one to answer, but I'm sure you'll talk through what the variables are that affect it. So what's the minimum viable scale for plantation forestry in a high to medium rainfall temperate zone?
We'd have to look at the specific carbon yield for that property. So again, my kind of explainer on how full CAM works is it is very specific to that exact coordinate. So we'd have to check in on that around what your carbon yield would be. Essentially, having a higher carbon yield will help you then if you don't have a huge amount of land. But you could also look through look at a couple of different options. So the government has just put through the opportunity to register similar to the reforestation project, the alternative assurance pathway for smaller plantation forestry projects. So again, that program allows you to essentially simplify your auditing and reporting costs because your project is smaller. They see it as quite low risk. So they'll complete the audits remotely using spatial mapping desktop analysis. And the reporting requirements themselves are also simplified. So that can help with your financial viability. Alternatively, you could look at doing something similar to our friends down in Gippsland in terms of an aggregated project. So potentially putting a few different properties in together to then essentially reach that sweet spot of being able to spread the costs across those properties and see a good return. But yeah, I'd recommend letting us run some numbers for you so that we can try and understand what that might look like specifically for your context.
All right, excellent. Thank you. Next question from Andrew. What is CFF's business model so that we can continue over such a long period supporting carbon projects?
Absolutely. So there's a lot of different models out there for carbon service providers. For us, as we've mentioned a couple of times, we are completely fee for service. So the way we do that is we essentially break up our engagements or our contracts, I suppose, into key milestones for the project. So when landowners do choose to partner with us on establishing a project, that contract will actually only last for the period of time it takes to establish the project. So getting it registered, either completing your baseline if you're soil carbon or planting your trees if you're vegetation based. Normally it's a 12 months to 24 month period for that. And it's just a set package fee for all of that inclusive. We then essentially don't have ongoing contracts. So we don't then have, or you don't have any obligations to pay us for ongoing advice or management fees or anything like that. We can then, we're more than happy to help out with advice, but we can either do that just on an hourly basis, or, you know, if it's a larger piece of work, we can pull together a quote for you. But essentially, we just do it in those chunks of work. So we do the establishment, and then when it comes to reporting, which is normally, first one's normally that 3-year mark or the 5-year mark, we will then pull together another package that's purely for that auditing and reporting. So again, that one normally is only like a 12-month sort of engagement. So we're here to help throughout the whole process, but it just means that you're not actually locked into necessarily using us the whole way through. You've got some more flexibility with how you want to manage your project, because essentially you own it at the end of the day.
Okay, and just in terms of CFF's business model, we are a charitable organisation, so we sit on a charitable fund, and our founder is very committed to using that to help expand carbon farming and ecosystem restoration across Australia. So that's one of the ways that we can keep our fees low. One question from John: can a project be terminated once it's started? So for instance, if they wanted to change their land over to something like a solar farm, can you end a project early?
Yes, so the requirements around finishing a project or finishing a project early really depends on what stage of the life cycle the project is on. So for example, if you were to cancel your project before you had had any credits issued, it's a much simpler process for you to be able to do that, because essentially, you know, the clean energy regulator is like, well, you haven't had any credits issued yet, that's okay. Whereas if you are looking to cancel your project later on after you have had credits issued, there could be the possibility that you actually have to pay those credits back to the clean energy regulator, because, you know, you're potentially clearing your trees, they're no longer sequestering the carbon. So there's a lot of nuances required around the specific context and time frame of the cancellation. It's definitely doable, but it's not necessarily a straightforward process. With regards to CFF though, you can cancel our contracts at any time. So that one's a lot simpler, which is good.
And there is some precedent for continuing soil carbon projects under solar farms. So you can graze sheep under the solar panels, just as long as they don't hinder access to the soil sampling points. So there are some ways around that where you could potentially keep a soil carbon project going and also have a solar farm sort of sitting on top of that. But I can send around some information about that with our email afterwards. Okay, looks like we have come to the end of our questions. So if you have any other questions that you'd like us to answer, please feel free to drop us an email. We are at hello@carbonfarming.org.au, and we will send round a video recording of this webinar afterwards so you can catch up on anything that you might have missed. Thank you very much for coming and spending some time with us today. If you would like to get in touch about setting up a feasibility assessment, or if you just have any questions about how carbon farming might work for your land, please do feel free to give us a call, or you can book a one-to-one session with a facilitator on our website. So thanks very much and have a great day.
Thanks, Nikki. Thanks everyone for coming.